Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Seeker and the Monk, Everyday Conversations with Thomas Merton, by Sophfronia Scott. Foreword by Barbara Brown Taylor. Narrated by Kellye A. Saunders. Foreword. Anyone who has practiced faith knows there is both an inside and an outside to it. To come inside after a long time outside is to find community, solace, and shelter. Depending on what kind of faith it is, a comforting blanket of certainty may be in the welcome bag, along with a clear set of expectations about how insiders behave. After a while, however, some of us find the community too chatty or the enclosure too small. Inside doesn't look the same from the inside as it did from the outside. Perhaps we just want to stretch our legs and be alone outside for a while, for reasons as mysterious as the ones that led us to come inside in the first place. Thomas Merton knew all about that. So does Sophfronia Scott, who met Merton in his journals more than 40 years after his death. Like him, she is gripped by the sacred. Like him, she writes divinely about being human. Like him, she knows the push and pull of faith, the view from both sides of the enclosure. Small wonder, then, that her sense of connection to Merton was instant. Hearing his work read out loud for the first time, she felt something open up inside her. It felt immense and small at the same time, she writes in the pages that follow, because it felt like one word. Yes. Yes, I thought, that's exactly it. You are likely to think the same thing as you listen to the conversation she strikes up with him in this book, as full of give and takes as if he were right beside her. There is none of the usual deference to a famous teacher. There is nothing timid in the dialogue she has with Merton about possessions, prayer, ambition, and social justice. When she talks with him about racism, it is as if they are sitting on his porch with yesterday's newspaper spread between them. When she speaks with him about death, it is with the gravity of someone who knows she is the same age now as Merton was when he died. It is easy to forget that these are conversations between a monk and a seeker. When Sophfronia calls him Thomas and offers him loving correction, it begins to sound more like a holy heart-to-heart that spans gender, race, vocation, history, and religious tradition. Spanning these differences may sound less grand to you than transcending them, but the distinctions between this particular monk and this particular seeker are too precious to be eclipsed. They prove that like-spirited people need not be alike. They show how people coming at faith from different directions can still reach for each other's hands when they make a run for it. Whether they are on their way in or out of their comfort zones, they recognize each other as kin. The beauty of this book is that I now feel the same way about them. Their intimate conversations open outward to include anyone listening in, confident that what is deeply true about any of us is deeply true about all of us. Both Sophfronia Scott and Thomas Merton believe they belong to each other, and that faith frees us to speak frankly about our struggles with faith. Wherever you are on your sacred way, rejoicing in newfound community, or walking alone in the woods, you have found two new conversation partners who know all about it. Between them and the spirit that unites them, they have you covered. Barbara Brown Taylor, New York Times best-selling author of An Altar in the World, Learning to Walk in the Dark, Holy Envy, and other books. 1. This monk who follows me around. Getting to know Thomas Merton. Of one thing I am certain. My life must have meaning. This meaning springs from a creative and intelligent harmony between my will and the will of God, a clarification by right action. But what is right action? What is the will of God? What are the sources of all my confusion on these? A few years ago, a friend of mine shared in my social media feed a Thomas Merton quote he'd come across in his reading. He added this comment to me: "There's your boy." I stared at the words for several minutes. Was Thomas Merton my boy? How could that be possible? Obviously, my friend was having a good time needling me. As he could see from my Goodreads updates, I read a lot of Merton. Every so often, I'd quote him, too. But the my boy thing knocked me upside my head with its incongruity. Thomas Merton was a white Catholic monk who lived most of his life in a monastery in Kentucky and died over 50 years ago. I'm a black woman, not Catholic, but Episcopalian, with Baptist notes from my childhood. We have nothing in common other than Ivy League educations. Mine from Harvard, his from Columbia, and a searching nature when it comes to faith. I am a seeker into the mystery of what tethers my life to the divine, and I long to see the notes of grace scattered in the crevices of experience, to learn how to read those messages continually saying, "I love you anyway." I want to talk of these things with a like-minded being, and yet, if I met him today at a cocktail party, I'd probably find Merton boisterous and slightly boorish. Later, I'd likely describe him to friends as having that entitled, mansplaining kind of tone that makes you keep your distance. But then, another friend asked me to join her on a panel about Thomas Merton for the Festival of Faith and Writing at Calvin College in Grand Rapids, Michigan. When I sat down on stage, it hit home that my fellow panelists were theologians or academic scholars. Merton's work is taught and studied worldwide. He left behind a voluminous collection of writing, dozens of books, essays, articles, lectures, and so much written correspondence it would choke an email inbox. He's considered a model of the pursuit of Christian faith and an influential voice on matters of social justice, race, religion, and activism, and his prophetic thoughts in these areas still ring true today. Pope Francis, in a speech to the U.S. Congress, called Merton a thinker who challenged the certitudes of his time and opened new horizons for souls and for the Church. He was also a man of dialogue, a promoter of peace between peoples and religions. So I felt impelled to tell the audience right away that I was not a scholar. "I just have this monk who follows me around," I said, "and he kind of mentors me and gives me advice." I described the strong sense I have of an ongoing dialogue with Merton as I forge along on my spiritual journey. I've had with him moments of learning, affirmation, surprise, and even disagreement. The more I spoke about him, the more I felt myself settling into the realization that, yes, I suppose he is my boy, and someone who has, across the many years and many differences between us, managed to become a dear friend. Torn Pages. I first met Thomas Merton in December 2011. I was at the start of a graduate program in which I would earn my Master of Fine Arts in Creative Writing when I heard a lecturer, Robert Vivian, quote an extended passage from Merton's Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. The section called The Night Spirit in the Dawn Air begins with, "How the Valley Awakes." Hearing those words, to put it simply, set my world on fire. The first chirps of the waking birds mark the point vierge of the dawn under a sky as yet without real light, a moment of awe and inexpressible innocence, when the Father in perfect silence opens their eyes. They begin to speak to him, not with fluent song, but with an awakening question That is their dawn state, their state at the point vierge. Their condition asks if it is time for them to be. He answers yes. Then they one by one wake up and become birds. They manifest themselves as birds beginning to sing. Presently they will be fully themselves and will even fly. Meanwhile, the most wonderful moment of the day is that when creation, in its innocence, asks permission to be once again, as it did on the first morning that ever was. Suddenly I wanted to be outside at the crack of dawn, eager to sense the voice of the Creator Spirit giving the waking birds this vital message, their cue. It is time for you to be. I too wanted God to tell me it was time for me to be. Merton goes on to say, "Here is an unspeakable secret. Paradise is all around us, and we do not understand." I felt something open up in my whole being. It felt immense and small at the same time, because it felt like one word. Yes. Yes, I thought. That's exactly it. I was so fascinated by what I'd heard that I immediately searched for the book in the online catalog at my local library. Notice I didn't buy the book, which I could have done easily in the moment. I was intrigued by Merton, but not enough to invest in him. As it turned out, the library didn't have conjectures, but I could borrow the book via interlibrary loan. I requested it and waited some more. When I received the email saying the book had finally arrived, I drove straight to the library, retrieved the book from the holds shelf, and opened it right there and then. That's how eager I was to see in print the words I'd heard, to see if they were as beautiful on the page as they had felt in my ears. I couldn't find them. I flipped through the book again and again, but I couldn't find the passage. I thought perhaps I'd gotten the name of the book wrong, or maybe the lecturer had mistakenly quoted a different Merton book. But then I noticed some ragged edges of paper, deep in the spine, and I realized the very pages I sought had been torn out. Call me crazy, but I took this as a sign. I felt as though something were telling me this wouldn't be casual curiosity. If the pages had been there, I may have read them, but not finished the whole book. I may have read the part I was seeking and then tossed the book aside, kind of like picking an apple in an orchard and only taking one bite. The fact that those very pages I was seeking were precious enough to another reader that they had kept them, well, it seemed like I was at the beginning of something that required more of my time and attention. So I purchased Conjectures, and then the autobiography that Merton made famous, The 7-Story Mountain. I dove into Mountain first. I wanted to know who this Merton guy was, and how he came to write his soul-searing words. He wrote Mountain when he was only 31 years old, and fewer than 5 years into the monastic life. I learned he was born in France in 1915. His parents were artists. His mother, a Quaker, died when he was 6. His father, from New Zealand, had Merton baptized in the Church of England. Merton's only sibling, a brother, was killed in action during World War II. As a teen, Merton had no real home, going from boarding school to attend Cambridge, where he was intent on studying drinking and women more than anything else. When he fathered a child out of wedlock, he never met the child, who, according to longtime Merton friend Jim Knight, was killed during a World War II German air raid in London. Merton's frustrated guardian finally had enough and sent him to live with relatives in America, Long Island, Queens. Merton entered Columbia University and seemed ready to continue his trail of indiscretions. But this time, his studies included spirituality and religion. Eventually, he writes, he became overwhelmed with a sudden and profound insight into the misery and corruption of his own soul, and converted to Roman Catholicism. He was 23 years old. Despite his poor behavior, there was something about Merton the person I liked right away. He reminded me of some of my Harvard classmates. A quick mind with multiple talents and interests. He could draw, he could write, he loved reading, he played sports, and he loved jazz. Once he converted, I was impressed with his ongoing praise of the saints and his complete embrace of the Holy Virgin Mary. I couldn't fathom how he had been a non-believer, because he didn't just convert. It's like he willingly jumped off a cliff, fully in love, placing his heart into something he could barely understand, and trusting that something, or someone, would uphold him. That is my sense of faith, too, and this sense drew me ever closer to him. I wanted to talk to him about it, and I knew he wouldn't be silent because I could tell he was a talker, ready to engage with any topic. In fact, maybe it was the sense that he was such a talker that made me feel like something was missing in the seven-story mountain. There were places where he seemed to be equivocating or speaking in generalities instead of in detail about certain events. The out-of-wedlock child, for example, I learned of elsewhere. He only writes about the results of the indiscretion. In one instance, it seemed this kept him from being accepted into the first monastic order he tried to enter, the Franciscans. He referred only to who he had been and said, "I seemed to have forgotten that I had ever sinned." And then he discussed how he had been asked to withdraw his application to the Franciscans. For what? I wondered. For being a college-age drinker? It didn't make sense. I felt as though I were getting only a muted version of the author. At first, I thought it was just me and my creative writing teacher antennae in overdrive. But a few months later, while browsing in my church's library, I came across Michael Mott's 1984 biography, The 7 Mountains of Thomas Merton. In perusing the 770-page tome, I learned my intuition had been right. Merton's book, all of his published work actually, had to go through approved channels of the Catholic Church, essentially through a censorship process. This process wasn't unique to Merton, but he certainly gave the censors enough to keep them quite busy. In 1952, his book, The Sign of Jonas, was initially banned from publication. In 1962, as his attention turned toward nuclear war and peace, he was told to stop writing on the subject. It was unbecoming of a monk. I also learned from Mott of a treasure trove. Merton had left behind extensive journals, 7 volumes in all, with the stipulation in his will that they not be published until 25 years after his death. I hit the internet as soon as I could and tracked down the 7 journals for myself. I had sensed a humanity about him that the 7-story mountain only hinted at. No, more than that. I felt if I could find Merton's true voice, I might find a kindred spirit, perhaps even a friend. In his journals, that is exactly what I found. The Private Merton. Merton's journals, which begin in 1939, when he was in his early 20s, before he entered the monastery, and detail his life's journey, with only a few pauses up until the days before his death in Thailand, pierced through the labels of monk, mystic, and prophet, and brought him to my side. He became Thomas to me, a flesh-and-blood companion. I call him Thomas, and will continue to, at times, address him directly as such in these sections, because it feels right to me. It's also how he responded during a 1940 encounter with 2 little girls in Havana, Cuba, who asked him his name. "Thomas, what's yours?" he responded. This was a man who did not see himself as special, who struggled to find and understand his place in God's creation, who wanted to be worthy of Christ's sacrifice, who expressed the very human emotions of doubt, anger, disappointment, and boredom. At another point in the journals, he wrote about a regular meeting called Chapter of his entire monastic community. "This morning had to talk in chapter about the Psalm of Sext," he wrote. "I am not so bored in chapter when I am the one talking." Yes, he made me laugh. He had his petty complaints. He didn't like the sound of the choir, and advertising bugged him. He read ads in a "what is this world coming to" kind of way. He didn't like it when people came to a jazz club and talked through the music instead of listening. It was fascinating to observe him in his formative 20s. He balanced a busyness and playfulness, always seeking to read even as he was writing and teaching, in addition to hanging out with his friends. His brash reviews of the art he saw at the World's Fair in Queens and of the books he'd read showed a brilliant mind at work, often with a youthful impatience. "I suppose if Melville Cain was to repeat the question to me this minute, I'd give back the same answer. On the other hand, I believe if W.H. Auden was to walk in the room and dare me to like the works of Melville Cain, I would stand up and like them just fine." No, I wouldn't. I was just fooling. The youthful Merton could also be tedious and melodramatic, especially right before he entered the Abbey of Gethsemane, the monastery in Kentucky where he lived much of his life. However, he knew enough to be sorry. "There are a lot of things I wish I had never said, because they were foolish, or because they hurt people, or because they were intended to, but mostly because they were absurd." Reading the journals gave me the mostly unvarnished Merton I sought. I say mostly because he sometimes edited himself, tearing out pages after he wrote them. I won't blame Merton for this. In fact, it endeared him to me more because he proved to be no different from other brash, confused young men. I loved his account of his travel to Cuba, of the saints with whom he became enamored, and of his struggle to figure out how exactly he was meant to serve God. He admitted, "I have a natural tendency to be an escapist, a snob, a narcissist, and my problems arise largely from guilt and attempts to cover up this guilt from myself and others." 3 years later, on the 14th anniversary of his ordination to the priesthood, he took inventory and counted himself as falling short. "I have certainly not been a model of priestly virtue. It does not seem that I have willfully sinned, i.e., with my eyes wide open, in a serious matter, but there have been repeated failures without number, like holes appearing everywhere in a worn-out garment. Nothing has been effectively patched. The moths have eaten me while I was confusedly intent on what seemed to be good or important or necessary for survival. Lately I have been uncharitable and unjust. I have not always been temperate, and if I go to town and someone pours me a drink, I don't resist another or even a third. And I have sometimes gone beyond the trivium perfectum, the perfect third. A monk? Probably the chief weakness has been lack of real courage to bear up under the attrition of monastic and priestly life. Anyway, I am worn down. I am easily discouraged. The depressions are deeper, more frequent. I am near 50. People think I am happy." Thomas, I thought when I read this passage, please allow me to be Lucy to your Charlie Brown. The fact that you realize you have a problem means you're not too far gone. 5 cents, please. Indeed, when he could have ripped out or simply not written about the most shocking aspect of his monk's life, the love he shared with a young woman he refers to as M, a nurse he met when recovering from back surgery during the spring of 1966. He notes specifically that he will not omit their story. "I have no intention of keeping the M business completely out of sight. I have always wanted to be completely open, both about my mistakes and about my effort to make sense out of my life," he writes. "The affair with M is an important part of it, and shows my limitations as well as a side of me that is, well, it needs to be known too, for it is part of me. My need for love, my loneliness, my inner division, the struggle in which solitude is at once a problem and a solution, and perhaps not a perfect solution either." He wanted all of himself to be known, including his messy and sometimes embarrassing adventure of learning to love, perhaps for the first time in his life. I was fascinated by the vulnerability he was willing to show. This was the person I wanted to learn from, and this is the material I dialogue with most in this book. I have also sought out his letters, and yes, I consult his traditionally known works. The early works that continue to provide spiritual food for those hungering for a path to connection. These include The Sign of Jonas and New Seeds of Contemplation, as well as his later works of activism, Seeds of Destruction, Raids of the Unspeakable, and Conjectures of a Guilty Bystander. But it is the unvarnished Merton of the 7 private journals, my Thomas, I converse with. He understands my bewilderment with politics, my desire to place ambition in its proper place. He knows my frustrations with holding out hope for my country's racial consciousness despite the delusions that abound. I want to share ideas with him about the mysterious activity called prayer and how one goes about reviving faith exhausted by trying times. I feel he has something to say about how we care for our earthly environment and why it's important to our souls. I want to talk about the possibility of transcendence, the very taste and feel of it, and its reverberating certainty of God all around us. The ever-changing reality in the midst of which we live should awaken us to the possibility of an uninterrupted dialogue with God, he writes in New Seeds of Contemplation. By this I do not mean continuous talk, but a dialogue of love and of choice, a dialogue of deep wills. I like to think Thomas and I have such a dialogue. Don't get me wrong, I'm not equating him with the divine. In fact, at times he seems like a man out to hack life, wanting to outsmart everything and everyone, even death. I take him to task in such moments. When he describes a Zen teaching on the power of sincerity or non-deceiving, he observes, "This power of non-deceiving is for me the all-important thing, and I lack it. That is, I have the seeds of it, but I do not let them grow. I begin to want to assure people of my sincerity, and then I deceive myself. And of course I am trying to deceive them that I am sincere." Thomas, I think to myself, and to him, I think this shows a lack of love for others. You think yourself smarter than everyone else, so even when you mean well, you think you will be misunderstood. So you have to double explain, hide, deceive. You don't trust them, nor do you really trust what is in your own heart. It sounds like a tiring way to be. The Why of Merton. But despite these issues, knowing Thomas helps me access and love the impossible world, to listen to the hope in birdsong, to go about my business with the playful diligence of a squirrel, to clear the trees in my life and not a forest when I need vision, to weed a patch of earth and find God, to understand that any consumer purchase requires something of my head and heart, not just my wallet, and needs spiritual consideration, to trust that I can and should have a voice in what I see going on in the world, and that my voice and everyone else's matters, to constantly seek the revelation that he himself experienced of love.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?